All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video, we're going to talk about Errol Spence Jr. and his soon-to-be mandatory Jaron Ennis. The Ennis camp gave a recent interview and talked about the politics related to that fight and how they think they may not get that fight no matter what happens. Let's talk about that in this video. Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon. In this video, we are going to talk about the welterweight division. Errol Spence Jr., who will be fighting Yordenis Ugas coming up April 16th, and also Jaron Ennis, who will be fighting Custio Clayton. I do not believe it's going to be on that undercard. Not sure what that fight is set for, but after those fights are over, Errol Spence Jr., more than likely Errol Spence Jr. and Jaron Ennis are headed on a collision course to fight each other because Jaron Ennis will be Errol Spence Jr.'s mandatory. But before we get into the meat of the discussion and what Boozy Ennis had to say about it, let me welcome you back to the channel. If you are not subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button and then hit the bell icon so that you can get notified of when we release more videos. All right, so these are two of my favorite fighters in the world. I think two of the top fighters in the world. One guy has proven it on a regular basis, and that is Errol the Truth Spence. Another is a fantastic talent at 147 pounds, Jaron Ennis, who is on his way to proving what a lot of people think about him, which is that he really could be one of the very special fighters that we have in this era of boxing. Guys like Sean Porter, who've talked about Jaron Ennis, have said, even though they say, hey, you know, a whole lot of people are jumping the gun on Jaron Ennis may actually be the best fighter we've had since Roy Jones Jr. And that, if you were not familiar with Roy Jones Jr., that is really saying a lot about Jaron Ennis. Now, there was an interview that was given by Boozy Ennis, who is the father of Jaron Ennis, to YSM Sports. It's a YouTube channel. Make sure you guys go check that out. They really do. They're always in the gym with Jaron Ennis. They're always in the gym with Steve Fulton Jr. and Boozy Ennis. Have a lot of really good interviews that those guys do. So make sure you go and support them and give them and lend those guys your ear. But Boozy Ennis was asked about it, like, when do you think Jaron is going to get his title shot, right? And he's like, look, man, I think he's going to get the title shot, you know, this year. You know, that's what he thinks. He's like, I think he'll get it later this year. He said, so that means that you believe that he's going to be able to get the Errol Spence Jr. fight next, because, you know, if you beat Custio Clayton, then, you know, you're going to become the mandatory. But then what Ennis said was, look, no, I'm not saying that. I don't know for sure if that's going to be the case, because, you know, there's a lot of real funny politics that go on. Just because we're the mandatory doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily mandate the fight or make that fight happen, because, you know, we're not with one of the really big promoters. And, you know, those type of funny things, you know, take place. In one instance that he uses an example was like, look what the WBC did to Jaron after Keith Thurman beat Mario Barrios. Keith Thurman leapfrogged Jaron Ennis in the rankings of the WBC. I think Jaron Ennis at the time was number 3, and then Keith Thurman came in and replaced him at number 3, and Keith Thurman went to number 3, and Jaron Ennis went to 4, right? So he's like, you just never know with what these guys are going to do, right? And he said, when you're not with one of the big promotional companies, and those big promotional companies, the promotional guys have different plans, for their fighters, right? So, it may be more realistic, just based off the logic that he used, that he may get, you know, maybe put in a situation where he could be the WBO mandatory for Terrence Crawford before he would actually be able to be the IBF mandatory, or get the mandatory fight ordered for Errol Spence Jr., right? Because if you look at what has happened with the IBF before, and I'm going to tell you, I do my personal observation is that of all of the sanctioned bodies that there are, the IBF is the one that is the most consistent with their rules. They're the ones that are the most, that they are the most fair of all of the sanctioned bodies. They will do things that other sanctioned bodies will not do in a million years. For example, at 160 pounds, they stripped Canelo Alvarez of his IBF belt because they refused to fight Sergey Deverenchenko. That is not something that the WBC would do. In fact, the WBC concocted a franchise champion rule specifically for Canelo so that they would never be put in that situation of saying, Canelo, this is your mandatory, and then Canelo or Eddie Reynoso more than likely Eddie Reynoso turning around and saying, no, we don't want to fight that guy. We're just going to go off into another weight class for a day, and we'll be back. Catch us later if you feel like not giving us a mandatory, right? The IBF didn't play that game. The IBF did ordered the fight, stripped Canelo Alvarez when he didn't fight Deverenchenko. Now, that is not to say, however, that the IBF is completely untouched by politics, or that they are necessarily that they will expedite things, right? So take Abu Karov, who was the last IBF mandatory for Errol Spence Jr. He wound up being the mandatory for Errol Spence Jr. for a couple years, while Errol Spence Jr. was, consolidating belts, right? Fighting Sean Porter, then fighting the WBC mandatory in Danny Garcia, right? And then after that, being allowed to have the fight with Manny Pacquiao, right? I think Abu Karov might have been getting paid step aside money, but whatever the case was, it took a little bit of time. So, while Boozy Ennis and Jaron Ennis are hopeful that they'll get that shot, they're saying, look, man, this could be different plans with different promoters. And I'm pretty sure I know in this particular circumstance who that would be. Here you have Errol Spence Jr., who's managed by, I do believe he's managed and advised by Al Haymon. You have Keith Thurman, who's managed and advised by Al Haymon. And those two guys, if you have a WBC mandatory fight coming up, and then they can't get the fight with Terrence Crawford done for whatever financial reasons that might be holding that up, Keith Thurman has said that he was already told that he was going to be the mandatory for Errol Spence Jr. Now the WBC came back and said, no, it's not a final eliminator. It's just a title eliminator. That's and try to clarify it. But if I have to bet my money on who I'm going to trust Keith Thurman in that, because Keith Thurman didn't sound like he was confused at all when he said it. Right. And the WBC will definitely do a two-step move on you, which is say, OK, I'm going to make my first move for this reason. And then they're going to find some other reason to change course for the second move. But it's going to get right where you thought it was going to be. Right. Right back to Keith. So Keith Thurman's not a mandatory. He didn't become the mandatory. But then they'll just wait and name a mandatory for some separate reason. So, it's politics and boxing, obviously. And Jaron Ennis, no joke, is good enough a fighter where politics will come into play or could come into play, just because guys don't want to see somebody like Errol knocked off before they have done everything that they wanted to do. And they're going to try to force this dude, might try to force Jaron Ennis to knock out some of the other contenders, before he gets to Errol Spence. But as far as Errol Spence himself, he's not, he's got the fight, the undisputed fight that he's going for next. And I think that is his real big thing. But he can't make networks and all of that stuff get outside of their plan. Another thing about Jaron Ennis is because he's with Showtime, those guys probably do have a plan for him as well, and just growing him over time and making sure that he doesn't jump out there too quick and wind up getting him beat, too early. But as a boxing fan, I would love to see the fight. I'll love to see the fight whenever it happens. But that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.